Well, hello and welcome. And welcome to this episode of what I've entitled Abiding Under Biden. Something I started doing shortly after the election when I realized that we as Christians in particular were going to be faced with some tremendous challenges because of the very clearly anti-Christian tone of the incoming administration and the many things they had on their legislative agenda. And as I mentioned in the last of these broadcasts, that this is what I call the Biden blitzkrieg. It's almost like firing off legislative action faster than we can imagine. Actually, he started with executive orders more than any president in the history of the country within the shortest period of time. This is the man who said in an interview before the election that executive orders were unconstitutional, and just as very consistent with Joe Biden, the Joe Biden I've followed for many years, that he's never worried about being consistent in what he says. I'm not sure whether he can't remember what he said last time or if he's just so sociopathic that whatever he's saying at the moment to him is truth, and it doesn't matter what the facts say. But be that as much as I want to talk about one of the legislative pieces that he's working on. In fact, next time I'll cover the second one, but two that are really critically important. One is called the Equality Act, and the other one is called the People's Act, basically H.R. 1. And the Equality Act, I think, would be more accurately described as being the Inequality Act. Basically, it's a bill that they've reintroduced over the last few years and it's been knocked down, but it's basically a bill that sounds good. It says it prohibits discrimination based upon sex and sexual orientation, but they've added in gender identity. And so gender identity is obviously one of those loose terms that refers to however I feel about myself at any given moment, that essentially it's saying in all areas of public accommodations, that's facilities, education, federal funding, employment, housing, credit, and in the jury system, that you can't discriminate over someone because of their gender. Now, it's obvious that this was a number one priority of the Biden administration when they came into power, and so that shouldn't be of any kind of a surprise. But I think it's important for me just to take enough time to kind of cover what are going to be the impacts of this legislation if it actually passes. It's not going to create equality. It's going to create a specialized group of people who are allowed all sorts of powers and privileges that aren't really available to the rest of us, and basically impose their value and lifestyle upon us. The first of these is going to have an impact to the church, and many people say, well, it's not going to affect the church because the churches are exempted out of it. And that's the problem with laws. It's all a matter of how they're interpreted, and once this law becomes entrenched in every other area of society, it will then be used to begin to go after the church, because basically the LGBTQ community really objects to the church saying that their lifestyle and behaviors are sin and could take them to hell. And so many churches are willing to kind of go quiet on the issue. Some are actually accommodating for those views. In fact, 50% of born-again Christians today believe that same-sex marriage is okay. So that wasn't supposed to affect us, but when it begins to affect the lifestyle, the values of the people and the culture, then it does have an impact. And by the way, people often say, well, you can't legislate morality, which is completely false. You absolutely can. What becomes legal becomes allowable, and what becomes allowable basically becomes the standard that people demand that you follow and live up to. And so it puts the church in some really, really difficult situations, because we dare not continue to take a stand on these issues, or we will not stand for anything. But basically, how does it affect the church? Well, basically, the church can no longer be able to hire based simply upon what somebody's beliefs are. And they may be able to say our pastors can't be a homosexual or a transsexual, but what about your bookkeeper? What about your janitor? What about the people that you contract? And if you hire somebody to do work, can you discriminate and say, we don't want that carpenter working on our building because of their sexuality? And the point is that under these rules, we will not be able to say that we cannot deny something to someone, even if they're an atheist and have a lifestyle that completely contradicts everything we stand for. In fact, what it may very well require that in our facilities that we allow other people to use them, if we allow anybody to use them, and most particularly, we can no longer have separate sex bathrooms, that we can't have male and female, that we'll have to have basically any gender bathrooms. And some people are going to say, oh, that's overreaction. Well, all you have to do is follow the history of legislation and you find out that it's no overreaction. It's just a matter of time before it'll become part of the law. More directly, it'll impact Christian education, because a school that receives federal funding at any level, or if they have students who are receiving federal funding enabling them to go to school, as happens with many Christian colleges, well, basically they can no longer use their moral restrictions anymore or sexual identity issues anymore. It'll affect their admission standards, who they can let in and can't let out. It'll affect their traditions, their standard of faith. If they hold to a view that the marriage or the biblical view of sexuality disagrees with these lifestyles, they will not be able to continue to operate. They can, in fact, be sued, as is happening in many cases already, by people in the LGBTQ, especially the transsexual community, for being allowed to become students on that campus. Their code of conducts can be all changed. You can no longer say it's wrong for couples to sleep together of any sex. And in fact, they may have to start including in their curriculum things that they would not really agree with. The third impact is that if you're a creative professional, I mean, it's always happened with all people like Jack Phillips or Baronella Blaine, who here in Washington, who's been sued by the state of Washington because they won't make flowers or cakes for, and also in Colorado, make cakes and flowers for homosexuals or transsexuals. And they've been fighting the courts for years now over this in the state of Washington. And you have to understand that there are also already 23 of the 50 states who have sexual orientation, gender identity laws. They're called SOGI, S-O-G-I. It's an acronym for sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity. They can no longer, they basically say you can't discriminate against these people because they have a lifestyle that you disagree with. It also will affect medical professionals because doctors will not be able to restrict providing sexual reassignment surgeries or hormones, puberty blockers, and all those things. I mean, if a doctor says, I'm not giving a 12-year-old a puberty blocker, he'll be in violation of the law and can be held liable criminally and also civilly. Even mental health professionals will not be allowed to say to somebody that your lifestyle choice is destructive, even though we know transsexuality is a very destructive lifestyle, not only physically but mentally and psychologically. Their addiction rates, their suicide rates, their psychological issues are above and beyond 100 times what everybody else faces in society. And yet many health professionals cannot say to him, you ever think it might be your lifestyle choices that's doing this? In fact, the Heritage Foundation points out that it said, quote, if a child, despite parental objections, asks for sexual transition therapy, then doctors must comply with the child's wishes. I mean, this is where the world has gone crazy, because the child can make determination that will affect his or her life for the rest of their life without any input from their parents. That fifthly, it's going to affect the area of housing, that colleges will not be able to any longer have single-sex dormitories. They'll have to have open sex. I mean, basically, guys living next door to girls, or basically your roommate can be a girl or a transsexual or homosexual. It could also require men who identify as women to live inside of women's dormitories. These are all things that seem kind of strange, but they're actually, they're hoping that once this passes into law, the trans community is actively going to pursue this in every legal way they can. They've made that very clear. And sixthly, what it does is it basically obliterates a woman's rights. I mean, basically being a woman doesn't mean anything, that no longer can she, well, we've seen it already, where in the state of Connecticut that two men who claim that they are women compete in women's sports and won 15 championships, state titles. Every single state title that's offered to women has been won by these two men. And these girls who have trained and disciplined and worked for scholarships now have been pushed to the back of the line, if they're allowed to be in line at all. As Sarah Kramer from the Alliance Defending Freedom put, essentially the Equality Act gives people of faith an ultimatum: change your faith-based practices or face government punishment. I mean, this is absolutely one of the worst pieces of legislation, most direct threats to people's civil liberties that's ever been presented in this country. And it's astounding that it's even being considered, but it gives you an idea how far we've drifted from the biblical foundation. And just in case you're not really clear, the Bible it says basically some 59 times that God created man to be male and female. Some 59 times it makes that statement, that everything in terms of the sexual gender identity is divided into two, male and female. That's the way God created them, and that's the way we have intuitively understood our relationships throughout human history. It's only in this new woke insanity that we find that people are willing to say something that's so illogical, unreasonable, unfactual, unscientific, and to do it with a straight face and actually begin to get legislation that will be voted on by 50 of the senators and a majority of the House representatives will vote in favor of this. It's insanity. Well, again, my whole goal in doing these short little broadcasts is to fulfill what the Scripture says in 2 Timothy 2:15. It said, "Be diligent to rightly divide the word of truth." And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get down to what does the Bible say? Because Paul made this warning in 1 Corinthians 14:8. He says, "If the trumpet makes an uncertain sound, who will prepare for battle?" So our goal here is just to give a very clear, certain sound as to what's going on, what we see happening, and how we as Christians need to respond. We need to first always recognize, and this is my prayer, that you will be in prayer. I think this is the biggest issue. Christians have just ignored these problems and haven't been praying about them. We need to really set aside just moments, if you will, every day to say, God, don't let this come to pass. And bring judgment upon those legislatures and politicians and corporate leaders who are pushing this agenda. We pray that you'd judge them harshly, that you'd bring down their house and cause things to collapse around them. Punish them for this overt wickedness. Please pray, and pray that they would come to Christ and be saved. Because many people are saying, well, we need to pray for their conversion. Well, certainly we need to pray for their conversion. But the Bible also says that he will judge evildoers. And it says because evil or judgment doesn't come quickly, that evildoers are quick to run and do more evil. So, as Solomon warned there in Ecclesiastes, we need to realize, God, bring judgment on it, because it's the one thing that will waken them and bring them to developing a conscience towards God. Even if they aren't saved, at least they would have a conscience towards God. Well, this is where I'm coming to an end, so pray that God will guide and direct you and put it on your heart to seek him for our deliverance from this incredible wave of darkness that's being unleashed upon our nation and around the world. Go in his grace.